Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to trace the incredibly powerful concept of boundaries, both the physical lines in the sand and the social lines we draw between each other. We're going to start way zoomed out, looking at the macro history of African nationalism and the massive fight for independence across the continent. And then we're going to zoom all the way in to look at the on-the-ground reality of the Afar pastoralists in modern-day Ethiopia. We want to see exactly how these big concepts of territory, identity, and resistance are playing out right now in the 21st century. Okay, let's kick things off with this incredibly defiant statement from 1890, because it immediately shatters a pretty huge historical misconception. The king of the Yao people in Tanzania told a German commander point blank, "I have listened to your words but can find no reason why I should obey you. I would rather die first. I am sultan here in my land." That fierce declaration completely proves that African societies didn't just passively roll over and accept colonial rule. It sets a tone of unwavering agency over their own borders and governance from the very beginning. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover the roots of African nationalism, the catalysts for freedom, and the independence struggle. Then we'll zoom in on the Afar people, their shifting pastoral boundaries, and finally, their ongoing identity evolution. Section 1. Roots of African nationalism. Let's start with the foundations of identity and resistance across the continent. When we talk about African nationalism, we're talking about a deeply subjective feeling of kinship based on shared culture, heritage, and a collective desire to defend territorial integrity. But the absolutely crucial detail here is that this predates colonialism. Long before Europeans ever arrived to draw arbitrary lines on a map, African communities like the Ashanti in Ghana or the Zulus in South Africa possessed a highly structured sense of national identity. They were sovereign nations, fiercely determined to defend their integrity against outside control. Section 2. Catalysts for freedom. As colonial rule was aggressively established, several immense external forces emerged. Now, instead of crushing this pre-existing national identity, the colonial era actually accelerated the demand for self-rule. It wasn't just one thing. It was a combination of 5 major drivers. You had the oppressive colonial experience itself, missionary churches, the 2 world wars, Pan-Africanism, and international platforms like the UN. Each of these acted as an unintended catalyst. They basically equipped colonized populations with the exact intellectual, psychological, and organizational tools they needed to challenge their oppressors.
Take the Christian missions, for example. Talk about a glaring contradiction, right? In theory, they taught this beautiful doctrine of equality under God and universal human brotherhood. But in practice, they often exhibited virulent racism, denigrated local rituals, and basically acted as apologists for the colonial state. This hypocrisy was a massive awakening. Educated in these exact mission schools, Africans learned European values and then cleverly turned those exact tools around. They used them to articulate their demands for freedom, pointing out that colonial rule fundamentally violated the colonizers' own stated religious values.
Then you have the monumental impact of global conflict. 2 million. That is how many Africans were drafted to serve the Allied forces in World War II. 2 million. These soldiers fought across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, acquiring modern military skills. But more importantly, fighting side by side with Europeans completely shattered this deeply ingrained, systematically enforced myth of the invincible white Superman. We call this profound psychological shift demythologization. In the absolute brutal reality of war, African soldiers saw that European soldiers bled, they cried, they were terrified, and they died just like anyone else. This first-hand discovery was a massive turning point. It decisively proved that European colonizers were not naturally superior. When these veterans returned home, they fueled the demand for the exact same freedom they had just risked their lives to secure for the Allies. Section 3. The independence struggle. With these powerful catalysts in motion, organizations began to form to solidify boundaries and reclaim sovereignty. The Pan-African movement was absolutely vital here, and it actually started outside of Africa. In 1900, Henry Sylvester Williams originated Pan-Africanism in London. By 1919, W.E.B. Du Bois was organizing in Paris, demanding human rights. But the 1945 Manchester Conference, that was the real game changer. Through these gatherings, Pan-Africanism evolved from a diaspora protest movement into a practical, actionable roadmap for independence, uniting future leaders like Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah. Section 4. Zooming in on the Afar. We've seen how these historical forces forged national identities across a whole continent. But what does the struggle for boundaries look like today? Let's zoom way in on the Horn of Africa, specifically the Badu wetlands in the Afar region of Ethiopia. It's a harsh, arid environment, but these wetlands provide a crucial retreat during droughts. Here, the Muslim Afar pastoralists are actively navigating their own complex boundaries of state pressure and territorial survival, right now, in the 21st century. So the Afar face immense pressure from the Ethiopian state, which has historically marginalized them and expropriated their land for commercial farming. In response, they've developed a really strong anti-assimilation discourse. They fiercely resist state interventions, terrified of losing their cultural authenticity, what they call Afar Ada. Just like early African nationalists pushed back on colonial culture, the Afar today use this anti-assimilation narrative to protect their ethno-national identity against a centralizing power. Section 5. Shifting pastoral boundaries. But the state is definitely not their only external pressure. They also face severe territorial conflicts with neighboring groups, like the Isa Somali pastoralists, who are expanding westward, competing for the exact same scarce grazing lands. Which brings us to a really fascinating question. How do you build a border in the desert? To secure their land, the Afar had to find a way to physically manifest a territorial claim in an open landscape where traditional drawn borders mean absolutely nothing. And this is their fascinating adaptation. It's a new mosque in Lis. It looks like a shabby mud and iron structure on the edge of a temporary village, and honestly, it's rarely even used for prayer. Pastoralists usually just pray outside. Instead, this building functions as a highly political, concrete boundary marker. By building a permanent religious structure, the Afar are physically staking a territorial claim to keep their Isa Somali rivals out. It is literally a border post disguised as a place of worship. Brilliant, right? Section 6. The ongoing identity evolution. As these physical boundaries shift, the internal social boundaries of the Afar are also transforming. Right now, there is a massive internal cultural tug-of-war happening. On one side, you have indigenous Afar practices guided by shamans called Gilnili, who use trance, predictions, and ancient rituals for weather forecasting and clan unity. On the other side, you have foreign-trained Islamic reformists, locally called Khuruj. They are pushing a strict purification of Islam, enforcing rigid prayers and actively banning those indigenous rituals, even threatening unblessed burials for those who don't comply. So how does this religious shift play out? Well, it actually splits right down economic lines, which shows us this is largely a survival strategy. Destitute cattle pastoralists who have lost their herds to drought are settling near towns, and they're frequently adopting this new reformist Islam to cope with poverty and find a new social support system. Conversely, the wealthier camel nomads, whose herds survive the droughts, continue their mobile lifestyle. Their leaders still rely heavily on the traditional Ginley shamans to predict grazing routes and defend their deep-rooted culture. Whether it's an entire continent demanding independence from colonial powers, or a pastoralist clan building a mud mosque in the desert to claim their grazing land, this explainer shows us that identity is inextricably tied to the boundaries we create and defend. We use history, religion, and culture to draw lines in the sand, both literally and figuratively. So I leave you with this. How are the boundaries of your own community, both physical and social, drawn, defended, and adapted over time? Thanks for joining this explainer, and keep questioning the lines that shape our world.